Chapter 4. The Mysterious Public. Grammar. The idea that counterterrorism and security generally exist to protect the public is not only the view from within the secret college. At least in the United States, government action, such as funding the Department of Homeland Security, must be taken for some articulable public purpose, or else it is unconstitutional. Statutes, therefore, generally begin with a statement of public purpose. Public here is mostly a gesture. To survive constitutional review, Congress must only articulate some public purpose. That is, here public basically means not private. Congress cannot take money from people via taxation, or more directly, and simply give it to individuals in their private capacities. Which is not to say that individuals cannot benefit and others suffer some harm from government action. Almost any regulation shifts wealth. In shifting wealth, however, Congress must provide some sort of public justification. So here, the concept of public can only be understood vis-a-vis its opposite, private. That is, neither public nor private has much content. The public to whom laws are dedicated, that the security community serves, like security itself, is a horizon for thought, understandable in conjunction with other abstractions, and is instantiated in particular settings. Ambivalent dualities abound. Ironies immediately arise. In the very public act of establishing Homeland Security, Congress created a realm of secrets, protected information. But, turning back around, the very notion of secret logically implies the countervailing idea of the public, those from whom the secret is kept. As discussed in the preceding chapter, secrets are a form of knowledge, hence secret college. At the same time, we also speak of public knowledge. Things that are public are known, or at least knowable. Indeed, shared knowledge, at least knowledge of a place or other context, is part of what constitutes a public. But what if the shared knowledge is of the existence of secrets, that is, awareness of not knowing? After terrorism, and after governments publicly create agencies that operate in secret, people know that they do not know, that they are all passengers on some airship of fools. In Humiliation, a song about targeted killing by drone, the National captures the mood. The surprise of the week is that I never heard the sound. Awareness of not knowing inspires conspiracy as explanation. While it is tempting to dismiss conspiracy thinking as delusional, sometimes conspiracies indeed exist. Somebody knows, plans, spies, and at some point acts. Terrorism requires planning, preparation, and so does interdiction. Some wars are conducted in secret. Such people must be among us, waiting for their opportunities, or just picking up this and that at the store on the way home to Bethesda. Too much thinking about conspiracy, however, erodes the very notion of public knowledge, which converges on official account, not too far from party line, unbelieved. Public knowledge comes to be regarded as tactical rhetoric, with the approximate candor of press releases and advertisements. In a spooky time, the public square becomes a hall of mirrors, and the truth is widely suspected to be out there, held by others. None of this is entirely new. Conspiracy is as old as politics. That said, there is no reason to think that suspicion is constant across time and place, and we seem to be living in a particularly suspicious moment. History matters, and this seems to be a particularly fragile time for the res publica, the things that we hold in common. No doubt many social dynamics are at play. Surely, for example, the radical rise in material inequality in all developed countries, which has more than a little to do with the development of new technologies, tears at the sense that we share public spaces. While there are no doubt other reasons for the current state of public, however, changing notions of security are part of the story. As already noted, security has been understood in different ways over the centuries. With the end of the Cold War, the word began to spread through the archipelago of contemporary social life and was used to describe all sorts of problems, not just the protection of airports and other critical infrastructure from armed attack. But as already suggested, security does not exist in conceptual isolation. As the foregoing few chapters demonstrate, security implicates other notions, often dyadic, like secret, public, known, anticipated, risk, uncertainty, and so forth. Taken together, such concepts constitute a conceptual grammar, or, to change images slightly, a matrix of thought. Changing the meaning of one word in the matrix affects the meanings of others. Some such changes are inevitable, even if the nature of the change might not be obvious in advance. The conceptual grammar with which security is thought is responsive to circumstance, and therefore articulated in different ways at different times. Changing notions of security thus imply changing notions of the public. As a result, what may superficially seem simple, such as the idea of the public that the secret college serves and for which the U.S. Congress legislates, turns out to be quite mysterious, shifting. Unsurprisingly, the evolution of the conceptual grammar seems somewhat clearer in hindsight. Here is an interpretation of the recent past that might be helpful. Like globalization, security evidently gestures effectively if vaguely towards something important about the times. The connections between the words is more intimate than it appears to be at first blush. In the years between the fall of the Berlin Wall and 9/11, much attention was paid to connections amongst things until then separated from one another and thought separately too. The world seemed to be knitting together, and there was much talk of networks, assemblages, neoliberal markets, and the like. Old particularities would be relegated to the dustbin of history. It was a moment. New awareness of connections, whether or not new in fact, brought new anxieties. What was lost? What if such channels, upon which we evidently depended, suddenly stopped? In particular, what if bad things flowed? Rapacious capitalism, migrant criminals, calls for genocide or terror, data breaches, strange disease, contaminated food, carbon dioxide from coal plants thousands of miles away, financial contagion. And soon enough, events confirmed and specified fears. 9/11, the global financial crisis, including the European debt crisis, migrant crises, the poisoning of social media, the brooding omnipresence of climate change and mass extinction, all this before the COVID-19 pandemic that broke out as this text was being finalized. Networks connected us, but sometimes to carry out terrorist attacks, to ship drugs, arms, or slaves, to steal data, elections, and perhaps our sense of self. The nation, indeed vehement nationalism, came roaring back, now also organized as a network. The moment the honeymoon was over, the contemporary was seen to be global and for that very reason insecure, vulnerable to dangers arriving unexpectedly. Here again, airports serve both as familiar instantiation and as metaphor. A revealing moment occurred in the wake of 2016 New York and New Jersey bombings. London Mayor Sadiq Khan was visiting New York at the time of the bombings, and perhaps feeling less pressure than usual while overseas. As a liberal and a Muslim, Khan attracts more than his fair share of negative attention. He blundered into a political minefield when he suggested that counterterror preparedness is part and parcel of living in a great global city. Including keen tweeter U.S. President Donald Trump, pounced, while his defenders muttered defensively about context. And context certainly does matter. That same year, the EU experienced 142 failed, foiled, or completed terrorist attacks, with the largest proportion occurring in the UK. Indeed, Khan's own city experienced a narrow miss when 2 would-be suicide bombers were apprehended after they asked Twitter followers to help them pick from the final short list of targets. By way of contrast, recall older notions of security centered around wars among independent nation-states. Through the Cold War, the purpose of the military was to provide security against foreign adversaries, albeit sometimes abetted by spies. In the darkening of the New World Order epitomized by 9/11, it became clear to the security community that the enemy was not just without the walls. Terrorists were members of the public, our own people. The public had become a mystery containing secrets. This sense of the enemy among us was not unprecedented. Few things are. Irish terrorists struck in England from time to time. Anarchists killed a U.S. president. But that was Ireland in the one case, and that was a long time ago in the other. September 11th changed everything, it was said over and over again, and a lot did in fact change. But September 11th was the deadliest event in a long string of bombings, shootings, trucks run amok in urban centers. In consequence, the security community received more powers to surveil and control. As a result, the public became, if not exactly the enemy, both the object of inquiry and the terrain on which security was achieved or not, all the while remaining the raison d'etre of security in the first place. Every contemporary discussion of an attack touches on whether or not the perpetrators were known to security services, public surveillance, the gathering of information that might prove to be useful, or that might suggest some threat has come to be expected. The secret college serves the public by watching, guarding over, monitoring. Worries about government overreach in the name of security were voiced immediately after 9/11 and have hardly subsided. The public's relation to the secret college grew even more ambivalent in the literal sense of simultaneously contradictory. security seems to have metastasized, and anxiety about security measures has kept pace. To recapitulate, the practice of security raises questions about the public that the security community serves. Public is understood in terms of private and vice versa. Public is also understood in contrast to secret, even if not strictly private, information, which mirrors earlier discussion of secret as akin to security. But a society riven by secrets is hardly to be understood on public terms. Conspiracy and spookiness seem more apt descriptions. Globalization provides networks for the transmission of unexpected dangers in the heart of the social order. The metastasis of security thinking, the understanding that danger is internal to the social order, terrorists within the walls, making the public the terrain and object of security, raising public fears about the security apparatus. All of which is intended to demonstrate how abstractions like security or public provide a grammar, but only a grammar, through which to think and discuss shifting circumstances. In what follows, we turn to circumstances and discuss two settings in which the public was instantiated. First, the public is the terrain of the counterterrorism police practice known as behavioral detection. Second, when an attack begins, what does the public, the people actually there at the time, do? How do such instantiations help us think about the source of public we might wish to be? Behavioral detection. As the 9/11 attacks conclusively demonstrated, numerous terrorists could not only hide in crowds, they could coordinate and ultimately carry out complex attacks. For the secret college, a key practical question was how were terrorists to be detected and interdicted before the attacks actually began. An experimental ethos arose in airport security, and behavioral detection was an innovation. Behavioral detection refers to a collection of tools and techniques that, used properly, enable operators to identify and so respond to abnormal and potentially dangerous activities in critical infrastructure sites like airports. A particular policing unit in the UK was widely regarded as having cracked the code and devised a comprehensive methodology for the detection of terrorists hiding in the murky waters of a crowd. Like alchemy, their methodology was and is a secret, but their results, as evidenced by arrest records, were pure gold. Senior policing and security figures were keen to know what worked and why. In due course, Mark was invited to join their training program. Behavioral detection is conducted alongside the use of a variety of standardized tools, including so-called first-generation biometrics, notably fingerprinting and facial recognition. Second-generation biometrics are already here. ATM-like machines that can ostensibly detect lies are already being tested. The near future promises smart corridors filled with sensors to detect abnormal bodily signals. Much behavioral detection, however, is low-tech and high-touch. That is, humans observing other humans in order to detect suspicious behavior. Such behavioral detection relies on culturally situated understanding of what is ordinary and what is not, and deserves further investigation. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Transport Security Administration, TSA, alone spends over $1 billion per annum observing human behavior. Most European countries and all major European airports now operate detection programs of variable quality. International airports have become technical universities in which a narrow ethnographic gaze is being trained on crowds each and every day. The training Mark received was in the Behavioral Detection Screening System, BAS, which began life in Boston's Logan Airport and quickly spread around the world. Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, was taken into custody at Logan. Done right, BAS is a counter-terrorist policing system that does far more than watch the public in an airport. Highly skilled officers assess an airport's behavioral environment in order to make subtle adjustments that will disrupt the baseline behaviors, so as to elicit responses that can then be interdicted. Rather than passively wait for something suspicious to happen, one hopes before the attack begins, BAS creates circumstances to which people must react. The underlying premise is that those with malicious intent and weapons will react to such circumstances in discernibly different ways, thereby giving themselves away. The U.S. Homeland Security approach is a watered-down version of BAS, and the approach taken in several European airports is also a low-cost version, in which poorly paid former baggage screeners are promoted to monitor crowds. Such watered-down versions may be worth little. The U.S. Government Accountability Office assessed the TSA system in 2011 and concluded that the results were the same or slightly better than chance. In contrast, bass policing, in the UK at least, produces outstanding arrest results. As discussed in Chapter 8, the reason for using a watered-down system when a better one is available is explained by the airport police maxim. We don't make money, we cost money. While it would be irresponsible to discuss sensitive operational matters, it is possible to give a feel for behavioral detection. In the course of one afternoon during training, the team with which Mark was on operational deployment encountered, inter alia, a young man carrying a significant quantity of cocaine. The team altered the crowd baseline, and the young man betrayed himself with the exaggerated bodily reactions of a 1920s silent movie actor. The team also stopped a man carrying a vast amount of cash while disguised as a priest. Later on, they identified and assisted a young woman who was traveling with an abusive partner under duress. These are the kinds of cases, and a fraction of the number, that a major airport deals with every day. But then things got really interesting. The team encountered a convicted terrorist who had been released under the Good Friday Agreement. The following is from the notes Mark took during a quiet moment later that day. I walked out of the conference room in the bowels of a regional British airport with the 12 other trainees. "Now for a bit of fun," said the senior trainer. "We'll chat on level 1, he said. "And if anyone says boo to you, say, 'I'm with him, I'm carrying a firearm, and the rest is none of your business.'" I held the door. The armed uniforms adjusted their protective jackets and weapons and followed us. They generally stayed quiet. The hierarchy was clear. The officers used personal mobile phones rather than radios. The more junior trainer came up to me, pointed at an information screen while saying, "You hear that? He's coming up in 2 minutes." I don't know where you stand on this, but to me, this man was a convicted murderer, and he's walking about like he never saw explosive in his life. You know there'll be trouble if we stop him. He's a citizen now. It's all in the past. You don't even think of staring. Habit, however, I looked at the gaze of my opposite number across the hall, and when he redirected his gaze, I involuntarily looked at the tall, thin, pale man. He glared at each member of the covert team in turn, smiled at us, and walked on. No one spoke. We reassembled behind a secure door. "It often happens," said the junior trainer. "They can see you, and you think you're hunting them. It's usually an ex-serviceman or special forces. He was a terrorist." The public under attack. What happens to the public during a terrorist attack? What do they do? What should they do? Since 2015, Mark has been exploring public behavior during terror attacks. He reconstructed a series of marauding terrorist attacks, MTAs, Milltown and Belfast, 1988, Glasgow Airport, 2007, the Westgate Mall in Nairobi, 2013, the Charlie Hebdo and Tallis train attacks in 2015, London Bridge and Borough Market in 2017, Duza D2 in Nairobi in 2019. On one level, this is a practical project about how to make spaces like airports safer, and there's significant media interest in how we, the public as constituted by media, behave in extraordinary situations. But paraethnography also opens the possibility of critique. Recall the demo. 10 minutes of running, hiding, bleeding, and dying, it would take time for Leviathan to arrive. The modern security bureaucracy cannot tolerate this. Force must be brought to bear and order must be restored. But bureaucracy, with its formal processes and procedures, lacks the agility. Therefore, it keeps people on retainer to handle such matters. Helicopters filled with black-clad specialists, individuals who say things like, "My business is killing." In those 10 minutes, though, and for just a little while longer, a life world is revealed and then hidden once more. Mark's work began with a study of emergency first responders. Ambulance crews with direct experience of terrorist atrocities describe encountering scenes that overwhelmed their senses and exceeded their training and experience. In short, terrorist attacks produced battlefield conditions. Their kit was lacking in the basic equipment carried by military medics, yet suddenly medics in the battlefield is what they were. After the 2015 Bataclan Theater massacre, for example, hospital workers received ambulance after ambulance filled with badly wounded victims. Their sense of horror only intensified when they saw that La Brigade de Sapeurs-Pompiers de Paris crews were using their own belts as tourniquets to stop victims from bleeding out. Members of the combat group RAID also described a sense of shock and professional inadequacy. As they attempted to clear the Bataclan in the dark, they wondered if the fire sprinklers had been triggered at some point, only to realize that it was not water, but several centimeters of blood that covered the theater floor. As they pressed forward under heavy fire, civilians grabbed at their legs, pleading for help and slowing their progress. It was hell. In Mark's project, first responders and combat groups have agreed that a greater emphasis on the public was needed as a first step in delivering aid and understanding behavioral environments. Responders want to train for better evacuation and work with special forces to learn about battlefield medicine. For their part, police special forces argue that if they better knew normal public behaviors, then they would be better placed to detect abnormal behaviors. At a deeper level, however, their training distanced them from the public. One Special Forces soldier who later went on to a policing role explained the problem bluntly. "You see," he said, "to us, at that moment, you are sheep. You are innocent and in the way, and our job is to herd you out of harm's way. The other side, their job, if they know what they're doing, is also to herd you so they can slaughter you." At present, in these circles, the public is an object to be moved, triaged, treated, protected, or eliminated. But this is an oversimplification. The public can do, or not do, many things, some better, some worse. Discussing the public during a terrorist attack, however, is a little like talking about the public in an airport. Who exactly do we have in mind? Are members of the public researchable communities or just individuals and groups thrown together momentarily in a society of strangers? Moreover, how can one possibly compare an event in Northern Ireland with one in Kenya, or an event in an airport with one in a small urban enclave? On the other hand, while differences exist, media reporting often sounds the same notes. Crowds apparently panic, and raw human emotions are exposed by sudden violence. Maybe the journalists are not wrong. Maybe broader lessons may be learned. What role do instincts play here, and how variable are human reactions along the lines of culture, gender, class, and age, for starters? Months of conversation with counterparts resulted in a list of case examples. Mark's research includes relatively recent events in a variety of spaces and regions to elicit the universal and particular in reactions, together with a sample of failed, foiled, and successful attacks. From the extraordinary marauding attack on Milltown Cemetery, Belfast 1988, forever captured by BBC cameras, to the massacre inside Nairobi's Westgate Mall, each case offers different points of interest, from the composition of the crowd to the aims of the attackers and the weapons deployed. Significantly, the time scale of each attack also varies considerably, from a few minutes in the case of Tallis to many hours, even days, in the case of Westgate Mall. Why focus on the first 10 minutes, such a precise time? In emergency medicine, there is a temporal concept called the golden hour, which refers to the period following traumatic injury during which medical intervention stands the greatest chance of saving a life. Emergency services also speak of the platinum 10 minutes, during which a crew assesses the event and implements their plan. All of this is to say that it is common to break up an event into moments when best practices can be implemented. Time matters, especially in emergencies. For counter-terrorist armed response teams, time also matters. The ideal scenario is to be on site already, or at least close. For example, when the 2015 San Bernardino attack occurred, a SWAT team, as luck would have it, was training nearby. The 2019 Dayton, Ohio attack was over in less than a minute, as nearby police officers shot the shooter. In the usual case, however, the counter-terrorist team is not on site and must travel to the scene. Transport takes time. The hope is that sufficient kinetic force can be delivered within a matter of minutes, but this is often optimistic. Once there, the armed counter-terrorist response team must clear the area, neutralizing all threats, before emergency medical aid can be delivered. This also takes time. The window for the treatment of victims may close. The nature of wounds must also be considered. During recent marauding attacks, the assailants came prepared. The Kouachi brothers, who attacked the Charlie Hebdo office, carried a submachine gun, a shotgun, and M70 assault rifles. The M70 fires a 7.62 millimeter round, ammunition that is designed specifically to devastate a human body. One graphic description from one of several Tier 1 soldiers who had witnessed the effects of such munitions. Think about you and a friend working on a tree, and you fall backwards off the ladder and land for a wee while on your mate's chainsaw. Something like that, except worse. The efficacy of such weapons shortens the time the victims have to get stabilized. The description is important because emergency medical teams in Europe rarely deal with gunshot wounds, and certainly not large numbers of victims who were hit by 7.62 millimeter rounds. In short, the nature of a marauding attack, the weapons used, and the structure of armed and medical response suggest a reasonably clear period of time, about 10 minutes, during which time the public cannot rely on professional aid and may act in more or less effective ways. During that time, the public will be alone with attackers, and even basic interventions, from evacuation to medical kits, can save lives. While much has been learned already, conclusions cannot be final. The public comprises people with many differences, some alluded to above. There is no baseline MTA. Moreover, people learn, and therefore public responses may change. In the attack at the STEM School Highlands Ranch in suburban Denver, 2019, for example, students fought, slowing the attackers, and packed the wounds of victims until medics arrived. The death toll was much lower than in some similar attacks involving very similar populations, perhaps at least partially for these reasons. Columbine was 20 years earlier and a few miles away. School shootings with battlefield-style wounds are quite thinkable in Denver, and people responded accordingly. To what extent should institutions and organizations anticipate such events? Should people be trained for them? In an MTA, most deaths result from bleeding. In the United States, there is a movement to train students, teachers, and other civilian bystanders how to respond to an MTA, and in particular, how to stem bleeding until help arrives. What might such second aid training entail? Military institutions have the most experience of battlefield-styled injuries. Therefore, over a 2-year period, Mark interviewed members of U.S., Irish, UK, and French Special Forces units on the subject of battlefield medical care. The lessons were clear. In the first minutes, literally minutes, of a marauding terrorist attack, one needs to connect bleeding victims with full medical trauma care. Failing that, time can be bought for bleeding victims with 3 things: tourniquets, blood-clotting agents, and packing. The latter 2 can be combined in hemostatic dressing that both mechanically packs and delivers a chemical clotting agent. To work, tourniquets, blood-clotting agents, and packing materials must be applied correctly. Perhaps surprisingly, there are few practical obstacles here. The materials are quite inexpensive. A kit retails at about €5, with some new technologies coming online for the application of hemostatic agents. It's also quite possible to teach people without medical training how to deal with bleed trauma. Military forces do it all the time and are happy to teach others, training the trainers. One might imagine a future in which such second aid was taught in schools and in suitable voluntary agencies. Second aid kits could be located in airports, transport hubs, stadiums, critical infrastructure sites, and at public gatherings, much like defibrillators. A Europe-wide campaign could install and map second aid kits, like the recent campaign to map defibrillators, which has proved itself to be a life-saving measure. Who could possibly disagree? Public, culture, ethnography. As mentioned, from the perspective of the counterterrorism combat teams, the public are sheep, to be evacuated from the scene of the attack and then kept out while the professionals neutralize the threat. Among the many failings of the Westgate Mall attack were the reciprocal failures to get people out and to establish a secure perimeter containing the attack. Hours into the attack, the mall could be and was entered and exited in various ways. In contrast, from the perspective of the medical teams, the public are primarily trauma victims to be stabilized on the spot and transported to hospital as expeditiously as possible. Both perspectives on the public are important, valuable, and true in their way. Certain perspectives are integral to the performance of certain jobs. Counter-terrorist operators need to get innocent people out of the way. Emergency medicine treats people as victims. Sheep and victim bespeak expertise. The purposes tell us that define very different enterprises. But the public is obviously much more than either sheep or victims. The truth of the expert is by definition partial, at most a view on the public, but hardly a rounded understanding. While experts are also, outside of their jobs, members of the public, that understanding is idiosyncratic and casual. Everyone has an opinion. Professionally, experts know that the public is something more than sheep or victims, but what? Experts, and bureaucracies comprising experts, and taking jurisdiction over public life, confront the public as a mystery. Here the social sciences, and ethnography in particular, can help. Without quibbling over semantics, representing the public is much like representing a culture, the traditional task of anthropology. Ethnography addresses the public and bureaucracies in many ways, discussed in the course of this book, but experts tend to have rather pragmatic demands. How, they tend to ask, can your presently abstract knowledge be translated into something I can use to help me do my job? Security experts of various sorts, ranging from unarmed airport police to counterterrorism teams, want to know more about what is normal behavior, or perhaps abnormal but harmless, and what signals that something more dangerous is afoot. Emergency personnel want to know what can be taught. School students in the United States are now routinely drilled in lockdown procedures and taught to prioritize their responses, run, hide, fight, in ways that the secret college determines will maximize their chances. In short, experts tend to treat the public as an object and scholarship as a resource that might help them achieve their objectives. Asking ethnography to help improve security practices, necessarily implicating violence, raises any number of intellectual and political problems. Any effort to bring scholarship, philosophy, to the aid of politics, especially violence, is problematic, and has been at least since Plato went to Syracuse to help the king. At this point in the text, however, it is worth articulating two thoughts to be developed. First, in any number of present situations, the structure of expert discourses creates limited views of the public. The public, both in the physical sense of actual crowds and places, and the broader sense of the social space betwixt and among the silos, evades articulation by experts, precisely because they are experts. We argue, however, that this public is not only a key space for contemporary anthropology, it offers the possibility of a sort of democratic politics. Getting there will require us to offer something of a theory of bureaucracy, and to suggest new roles for ethnography, whether or not understood as an academic enterprise. Second, the sorts of interventions that expert discourses request change the environment in which we live and are therefore at bottom public and political and not expert questions. During the Cold War, school children were told to duck and cover under their desks. This was ridiculed, but now they are taught much the same thing, and also how to pack a wound to staunch internal bleeding. Few of these children will confront an MTA. In the United States, however, MTAs are increasingly woven into the social fabric. In what may or may not be denial, the response to the threat of MTAs in Europe has so far been much more muted. The more general question, however, is at what point do the demands of security experts, or any other experts, become excessive? As argued in Chapter 2, the logic of paranoia within reason has no endpoint. Ethnography can help us step outside the security discourse and ask after public values. We are quite aware that extensions of state power are commonly understood in the academy as efforts to achieve the dark dream at the heart of the state, total supremacy. As discussed, the logic of paranoia within reason is totalitarian. The practice may not be. That is, organizations and individuals generally do not follow their logics to their often bitter ends. That said, totalitarianism certainly must be feared today. It also bears remembering, however, that the extensions of state power discussed here happened in the wake of 9/11. That is, the state extended its power in response to massive failure. To the question of failure, we now turn.